counter to that story effectively. And basically we failed to tell the story of the reality of the Afghan government and state under Hamid Karzai. And we can think about why we haven't told that story well enough and how we might tell it more effectively, and I'll offer a few ideas. But the history of the Taliban is now well known, and of course before the war, the people trying to expose the Taliban tended to be solidarity activists, small groups of feminists, and often leftists and anti-war folks who were trying to expose the human rights catastrophe of women during the Taliban years and going back much further. Sorry, I've gone off my 3 points. It's good to keep numbered points. But basically, the three aspects of the current Afghan government and state that we haven't explained, we could break it down into three things. It's the fact of the warlordism, the dominance of warlords, and what that really means. Drug lords and drug traffickers, and continuing dominance of fundamentalists and extremists, and through that, the continuing absolute oppression of Afghan women, among others. So just on warlords, let's start on warlords. We have a harder story to tell because it's easy to understand the Taliban just from popular culture. That's one word, and it invokes images and people, right? But we have this problem when Malala, she speaks very fast. When she would give her speech about what's wrong in Afghanistan, she would say, and we have the dominance of these fundamentalist warlords, Dostov, Saif, Fahim, and the list would be like a dozen or 24 names of these warlords. So we have a real problem. People might have an idea that there are some nasty warlords still around, but I don't think they understand the concept that these warlords are in fact the dominant element of the government, that they share the same misogynist outlook as the Taliban, and people just don't know their personal stories because it's harder to tell. So one warlord that I think is worth focusing on, and he's no longer one of the real heavyweights, although he's a very big guy, an imposing figure, but he's sort of like a godfather. He's a senior warlord, but he's no longer one of the 2 or 3 big power brokers. But I think his story needs to be told, and this is Saif, Abdul Saif. How many people have heard of Saif, the warlord Saif in Afghanistan? Okay, so this is, I think we need to tell his story and highlight his history. So Saif essentially has a small fiefdom, a very small area under his control. It's Pagman, which is near Kabul, sort of a suburb of Kabul, traditionally a wealthier neighborhood. Saif has a private army, private prisons, and a small area of Afghanistan under his control. So that's not that exciting. He's a member of parliament. He campaigned for Karzai in this last fraudulent election. And so in that sense, he's like so many of the other warlords that are allied with Karzai. But Saif in the 1980s was also the person who, this is documented in many mainstream sources, invited Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan to fight the anti-Soviet war. So this would seem to be a significant point to explain to Americans. The person who invited Osama bin Laden, who later, and even before the Taliban years, helped to build the training camps that were targeted by Clinton, for instance, and then after 2001, the training camps where supposedly thousands of al-Qaeda operatives through the years trained, those were built by Saif and bin Laden and others. The Abu Sayyaf insurgency in the southern Philippines is named in honor of Saif. So he's a godfather not only of the Afghan warlords, but he's in very, very real ways a godfather of international terrorism, this particular variety of international terrorism. So why don't Americans know about Saif? Why has there never been a 60 minutes, an hour-long thing about this guy explaining that he now sits in parliament and he was one of the honored, the people given a central role from the beginning, from the Bonn process in 2001, the Loya Jirga in 2003. He was there the whole time. So I think by telling the story of someone like Saif and explaining that history as part of our anti-war educational work, we can sort of make a more effective point than with just the abstraction warlords. Because if you just say warlords versus the Taliban, people don't have an actual understanding of what the warlords signify, so they might logically think, well, okay, maybe the Taliban's the lesser evil. So the second point is on drug lords. And I don't think we say enough that Afghanistan is now a narco state. Someone in the panel this morning made the point that the Taliban drug interdiction program, which in 2000 or 2001, the rate of opium production and export just dropped off completely. The guy this morning described it as probably the most effective drug interdiction program in world history. So the Taliban did this as one of their last acts in government, if you will. Since then, and in the post-war period, the rates of opium production and export have exploded. They have absolutely exploded. But all we hear about in the media is that, oh, well, the Taliban's getting their money from the drug trade. Well, some of that may be true, but that's a tiny portion of the narco-state economy of Afghanistan. The vast majority of the drug profits from the opium trade are being taken by those warlords, are being directly taken by the Karzai family and the Karzai government. And this, I think, is crucial, that the Karzai family itself is heavily implicated and involved in the drug trade. I'll talk a little bit more in a second about Karzai's little brother, because I want to talk about one province in particular. But even the New York Times has pointed out that Karzai's little brother in Kandahar is a drug trafficker. And I'll talk a little more at Kandahar in a second. But the last point is just on the continued dominance of fundamentalists. And this goes to the issue of women's rights. So how many people know, I mean, this is not necessarily indicative of a fundamentalist setup politically or in the justice system, but how many people know that the full name of Afghanistan today is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan?
That's the Taliban.
Again, I mean, it's not well publicized, but it's been the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan since the 90s period after the Russians left and that there was a civil war. Great. I can do that. and I promised I would. So, but in the post-Taliban constitutional process, people like Saif and a host of other fundamentalists insisted again that it have that name. But more importantly, they saw to it that the entire Supreme Court was stacked full of fundamentalist mullahs, many of them trained in Iran, Saudi Arabia, elsewhere. And so the head of the Supreme Court post-war was a guy named Mullah Shinwari. He was personally put into that position by Saif. And that meant that for the last 8.5 years, there has been absolutely no justice for women in Afghanistan. They've technically adopted a constitution that, you know, gives lip service to women's rights, but throughout the court system, there is absolutely no justice for Afghan women. And I think it was Tariq Ali was speaking and jokingly made this point. It's not something to joke about, but he told it in a funny way. At least in the Taliban years, Afghan women knew that in a lot of cases their rapist would be brutally punished in very inhumane ways, but there would be summary and brutal justice. What happens under the rule of these fundamentalist warlords is a different thing. It's absolute impunity for rapists, for people who abduct women and children, and people who traffic in women and children. There's simply no justice. And so just one thing to highlight on this is that the rate of women's suicide is higher than it's ever been in Afghanistan over the last few years. And there's a veritable epidemic of women lighting themselves on fire, self-immolating to commit suicide. And they're doing this not just as a way of ending their pain and ending their lives, but they're doing it as a show of protest. Some women have even killed themselves, lit themselves on fire in front of the local courthouse to say, you know, I was raped, I got no justice, this is my last act of defiance. But we don't hear those stories, and I really think we have to highlight them. I was going to go a little more into detail in Kandahar, but we can get into that in the discussion. Kandahar is the home base of the Taliban. But if you wonder why the Taliban is gaining, I think they have something like 2/3 support in Kandahar by, you know, pro-war polling firms have found in Kandahar the occupation is just not popular. Well, part of it is the fact that Karzai's little brother is the most powerful guy in Kandahar. He's trafficking drugs. He's on the CIA payroll, by the way. The New York Times also verified that. He's even charging the United States Special Forces to use Mullah Omar's old compound. So the guy is like employee, landlord, drug runner. He's an employee and landlord of the CIA in the US. So it's a very absurd situation.